So we are so lucky tonight to have Deborah Rogers with us all the way from Texas. And she is a wealth of knowledge. She began her financial career in London, working in corporate finance, specifically venture capital, during the Thatcher years. Upon her return to the US, she worked as a financial consultant for nearly a decade for several major Wall Street firms, including Merrill Lynch and Smith Barney. She then struck out on an entrepreneurial venture in 2003 with the founding of Deborah's Farmstead, an artisanal cheese-making operation. From a small herd of about 40 milkers, she quickly established the company as one of the premier artisanal cheese dairies in the United States. Her cheeses have won several national awards in the prestigious American Cheese Society competition, which attracts competitors from all around the world. In addition, she is known for her innovative farming techniques, which have brought the farm and dairy acclaim in the national farming press. She was featured in the June 2011 New York Times article, quote, "Insider Sounds an Alarm Amid a National Natural Gas Rush." She recently launched Energy Policy Forum as the preeminent website and blog for discussing the complex problems inherent in shale gas development. The Energy Policy Forum provides a comprehensive meeting ground where geologists and experts from different fields like science, environmental, and the economic financial areas can educate each other about the economic discrepancies and environmental dangers that surround shale gas drilling. She became involved in natural gas drilling when she learned that an energy company planned 12 high-impact wells next to her property. Deborah's Farmstead, since 2009, she has spoken publicly on economics and other topics regarding shale gas drilling and is currently on a major speaking tour throughout New York. After working more than 10 years as a financial analyst, it wasn't very difficult to find discrepancies in the public reportings of financial records belonging to various public companies once I explained them, she said. And she served on the advisory council for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas since 2008. In 2011, she was appointed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality to a task force reviewing placement of air monitors in the Barnett Shale region. Her appointment was in response to air quality concerns brought about by the natural gas operations in North Texas. She joined a regional steering committee for the Oil and Gas Accountability Project in 2011 with the responsibility of addressing economic questions. Please hold your questions until after she shares with us her program tonight, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right? Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. I told this story last night, but I'll tell it again. I hope none of you were there last night, so I won't bore you too much. But I arrived here on Sunday night, and I arrived in Binghamton, as a matter of fact, and the captain announced that it was 7 degrees outside when we landed. And I thought, I don't have to get off this plane. And so then I decided, yes, I do, and I braved it, and I got out, and I made my way to the rental car, and it was snowing and blowing a gale, and I was absolutely freezing, and it was dark, and I unlocked the car and pulled the door handle, and the door handle came out, but nothing happened. And I sat there for a moment. I thought, I don't understand. And then it hit me. It took me a couple of seconds, and it hit me, and I yanked on the door, and it came open, and I thought, oh, God, Deborah, you are not in Kansas anymore. So I know that economics can be very dry indeed, but I will do my best to make it as interesting as possible for you tonight. Let's get started. As she just mentioned, I was featured in an article which the New York Times did last summer, which exposed the financial anomalies of shale gas production. A few weeks after the article came out, in July, The Securities and Exchange Commission began issuing subpoenas to a number of shale gas companies. A couple of weeks after that, your own New York State Attorney General began issuing subpoenas as well. And a few weeks after that, the Department of Energy slashed estimates of the Marcellus Shale by 80%. It turned out that the prior estimates that had been provided to government had come primarily from industry. So you may be wondering what's going on here and why all the questions. Well, there's no doubt that gas exists in shale, that's a given. But shale gas has been touted as a cheap and abundant source of energy. Much emphasis has been focused purely on the amount of gas trapped in shales, but much of this gas may never be commercially extractable unless natural gas prices rise dramatically, and then of course natural gas is no longer a cheap form of energy. And this is something that we all need to keep in mind when addressing not only our national energy policy, but also addressing the questions of how we allow our own regions, indeed our own neighborhoods, to be exploited for this resource. The questions facing this city, this region, are the same facing every city and region where shale gas is exploited. It's important to sift through all the hype and rhetoric to assess whether production can truly be counted on to provide the benefits that industry has claimed. For instance, is production as secure as it appears? Will jobs and taxes really be as stable as claimed? What will the environmental impacts be? And can we count on energy independence truly from unconventional oil and gas? Those are some of the questions I'd like to answer for you tonight. I've never seen an investment more hyped than shale gas. Wall Street loves a sexy story, and shale gas provides just that with its incredible horizontal drilling techniques and Hollywood pyrotechnics of fracture stimulation. It was an easy sell. It started with the Barnett, then the Fayetteville, the Haynesville, the Marcellus, the Bakken, the Eagle Ford. Now we've jumped upon their drilling in the UK, Poland, going into India and China. It's truly gone global. All the while, however, the hype has reached ever giddy heights, with every shale play claimed to be better than the last. We've all heard the slogans, game changer, national treasure, shale gas revolution, 100 years of gas available, and energy independence for all. But being ever the contrarian, I began to question shale gas several years ago in 2009. After years in the financial markets in Europe and the US, the one thing I've learned that if anything is hyped to this extent, you best beware. Once I began digging, I found that jobs had been overstated, taxes and revenues had been overstated, reserves overstated, and economic stability overstated. So let's begin to look at some of the claims that have been made, or as I like to state it, let's look at some of the rhetoric versus the reality. Okay, this is a quote from Jim Mulva, who's CEO of ConocoPhillips. He says, "If oil is the prize, then natural gas is the gift, nature's gift to the people of the world." However, Platts Oil and Gas Reporter, which is one of the, if not the preeminent industry publication in this country, says, "The switch from shale gas to shale oil suggests that shale gas can survive only through cross-subsidization, not on its own merit. Perpetual expansion cannot forever disguise a serious problem with the bottom line." Mr. Mulva went on to say, "Gas can enhance energy supply security through its abundance. There's enough to meet industrial, residential, commercial, and power generation needs." However, Bernstein Research, which is a financial research firm very well respected in New York, in Manhattan, had this to say, "Recent frac data from the Barnett shows a play in severe decline. The Barnett's well failure rate also continues to rise over time." And of course, as I mentioned before, the U.S. Geological Survey came in recently and slashed the Department of Energy's estimates for the Marcellus reserves by 80%. By the way, I'm going to talk a lot tonight about the Barnett. That's where I happen to be from. But I want to explain why, because you may be wondering, what does that have to do with us up here in the Marcellus? Well, shale gas plays typically, essentially work the same. And so what you want to do is use the older plays as a cautionary tale. You want to look at those and see what's happened, what's the historical production records, etc., because we have a much longer track record. And so once you look at that, you can extrapolate out and you can see what's heading your direction. Okay, there appears to be a great deal of confusion regarding production versus reserves. A leading argument states that shale gas has risen from 2% of all natural gas production in 2000 to 23% 10 years later, a statistic the MIT group calls a paradigm shift. But this is misleading unless put into context. drilling for conventional gas, and I always have to ask this, does everybody understand the difference between conventional and unconventional gas, or shall I define it very quickly? Why don't I define it? Okay, conventional gas is what we've done forever. It's you drop a vertical wellbore and you've done your geology and you've identified a pocket of gas or oil deep within the earth, and you drop your vertical wellbore straight down into that pocket and extract the resource. Unconventional oil and gas is when you drop a vertical wellbore and then once you hit the formation, you go out horizontally. The technology is astonishing. They can do corkscrews with this technology. They can go out, conceivably, they can go out, they could go around buildings and back out if they wanted to. It is truly an astonishing technology. What they typically do is they will run the horizontal, they call them laterals, out in a spoke pattern from the vertical wellbore. We now have in Texas up to 24 wellbores per pad site. So the density is immense. But that's the difference between conventional and unconventional oil or gas. So drilling for conventional gas, i.e. the vertical wellbores, the old way of doing it, in this country began to wane in the 70s. When shale gas burst on the scene, Wall Street was only too happy to invest in the sexy new story, and consequently, investment in conventional gas projects has been absolutely decimated. The money just dried up overnight, and there's no monies available for conventional gas. So, shale gas has grown as a percentage of all natural gas, but it's been at the expense of conventional gas projects. It is not adding to existing and growing supplies of gas. It is merely replacing them. The Energy Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy, estimates that natural gas will grow by only 0.8 per annum through 2030 because conventional projects will be depleting and not being replaced by other conventional projects. They'll be being replaced by shale gas. So is this a boom? Well, it's certainly been characterized as a boom. But it makes sense to look at some of the underlying reasons for the rises in production. It's a fact that while gas prices were plummeting, many shale companies continued to drill rather than shut in wells, which has always been the traditional approach for low prices in the oil and gas industry. Shale wells, however, were depleting so quickly that new wells had to be drilled continuously in order to maintain cash flow. Given the heavy debt burdens of some of these shale gas companies, and they were very heavy indeed, drilling was a way to meet debt service. Financial analysts and journalists began referring to this about a year and a half ago or so as a drilling treadmill. They simply couldn't get off without declaring bankruptcy. So, an excellent example of this drilling treadmill can be seen in the audited accounts of the city of Fort Worth, where I live in the Barnett Shale. In 2008, the city received approximately $50 million in gas revenues. This dropped precipitously in 2009 to about $19 million. In 2010, it began to trend back up and closed the year at approximately $38 million. Now, on the surface of things, it would look as though we're recovering from the economic downturn and everything is returning to normal, and that's certainly the spin that industry put on it. However, the first question that I ask, because you really can't tell anything from these numbers until you look at the numbers of wells that were drilled at the same time. So I went back and looked into this, and between 2008 and 2010, the number of producing wells within the city grew more than fourfold. So even though there were now 4 times more wells within the city, these new wells could only keep revenues at 2/3 of the levels seen in 2008. And this was due to the severe depletion rates. So essentially what's happening is your older wells are depleting so quickly that your new wells, even though they're coming online, they can't keep revenues at the same levels. So, and by the way, this pattern has occurred repeatedly throughout North Texas. Denton County saw a 58% increase in the number of wells for a 23% decrease in revenues. The wells at DFW Airport have come in with dismal returns. They never came near the original projections of Chesapeake Energy, and have now plummeted so precipitously that at year-end 2011, the geologists estimate, and I haven't seen these numbers yet, but I talked to them, this was in mid-December, they told me that they're estimating that the DFW wells will be 1/10 of what the original projections were. The University of Texas at Arlington, which is right in between Dallas and Fort Worth, saw revenues peak at $7 million with a mere 6 wells on campus, only to plummet drastically in a matter of months. And revenues by the end of 2010 were down to $800,000, even though there are now 22 wells on campus. So, taxes and revenues have also been overstated in the Marcellus. And this is according to a recent study that came out just a few months ago by Penn State. And I'm quoting here that study. Only 18% of municipalities directly experiencing drilling activity said their tax revenues had increased, while 26% of the local governments had indicated that their costs had increased. This happens throughout every shale play. The truck traffic tears up your roads. I mean, you have all sorts of municipal costs once gas drilling comes to town. They also went on to say that these findings from local officials contrast with prior economic studies, which predicted that there would be a large local tax impact, but which did not verify what has actually occurred. Okay, so while the wells were proliferating and revenues were plummeting, gas drilling was, however, providing something else, and that was pollution and environmental degradation. The city of Fort Worth released the findings of an environmental impact study just last summer. I've been making a joke about this. It's not really funny if you live there like I do, but we're not big on environmental impact studies in Texas. We don't do them until after we've already drilled 15,000 wells. And then we decide, gee, maybe we ought to take a look at what the impact is to the neighborhoods. So that's indeed what the city of Fort Worth did, and what they found out was a bit disturbing. Benzene, which is a known human carcinogen, has been detected at measurable quantities at 94% of all the sites within the city proper. And by the way, I don't know how many of you have been to Fort Worth, but Fort Worth is a large city. It's a city of 800,000 people, so it's densely populated. And these pad sites within the city run about, on a grid pattern, about every half mile apart, north, south, east, and west. So we have benzene coming out at 94% of all sites tested. Other toxics of concern were found, including we had the highest levels of formaldehyde near a compressor station on the east side of town that the scientists had ever seen on the planet, any place on the planet outside of Brazil. Formaldehyde is also well, the World Health Organization considers it a known human carcinogen. EPA considers it a suspected human carcinogen. We also had sulfur compounds. Very, very high levels of carbon disulfide, which is a known neurotoxin. At my farm, where they've done extensive testing, we've had carbon disulfide levels during drilling activities which have been anywhere from 300 to 500 times what is normal for ambient urban air. And this is according to EPA. The TCEQ, which is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that's our equivalent of the DEC, confirmed recently that that drilling activities contribute more air toxics than all the cars, trucks, and airplanes in the region combined. And Fort Worth, Tarrant County, now has our incidence of childhood asthma is more than double the national average. In addition, we now have the dubious distinction of having passed the Dallas-Fort Worth region, having passed Houston as the most polluted air, the place with the most polluted air in the state of Texas. And if any of you have ever been to Houston and experienced the Houston Ship Channel, you know that that's saying quite a lot. So, let's look at some of the hype surrounding jobs creation. A study was done in 2010, and it was funded by industry, and it claimed that 44,000 jobs had been created in the state of Pennsylvania due to shale gas extraction, and $7.1 billion in economic activity. However, the Penn State study disagreed with that. They said that this is a quote from the Times Tribune, quoting talking about the Penn State study. A new study of the economic impacts of the Marcellus Shale has found that natural gas development created roughly half the jobs and economic activity reported in earlier industry-funded studies. Ohio State just released a study just a few weeks ago on projections for Ohio, and then they also did some work on what has actually happened in Pennsylvania. What they found was industry has projected 200,000 jobs for Ohio. Ohio State estimates that there will only be 1/10 of that, about 20,000 jobs at best. industry originally projected 100,000 jobs for Pennsylvania. They revised their numbers down to 44,000, as we just saw. But Ohio State estimates that there's actually only been 20,000 jobs created in Pennsylvania. The other thing that you have to keep in mind with jobs creation is when they come in and they say, we're going to bring 20,000 new jobs into the area, you also have to keep in mind that's wonderful, but how many jobs are going to go away because of gas drilling brought into the area? And I'm talking about jobs in the tourism industry or organic farming, or, I mean, there are any number of other industries where jobs will be affected and jobs will actually go away. So it is very misleading to listen to industry say, well, we're going to bring the X number of jobs in, because you don't really know what the net job gain or loss will be after everything plays out. And of course, tourism is a large part of your economy here. So this isn't the first time that jobs have been or jobs numbers have been over or inflated. The Perryman Group was hired by the Chamber of Commerce about 3 years ago now, to give a presentation on jobs creation in the Barnett. And they claimed that there were 111,000 direct industry jobs from shale production in North Texas alone. And I sat there and I thought, I just don't believe that. So I went and I checked and with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it turned out that there were only 166,000 total direct industry jobs onshore and offshore for the entire U.S. in the oil and gas sector. And we were to believe that 111,000 of those were occurring in North Texas. A year later, Chesapeake Energy claimed that there were 53,200 direct industry jobs. Please note that in spite of the fact that the Barnett was touted as an economic powerhouse for the next 40 years, jobs in 1 year had halved. And this was just in the Fort Worth-Arlington region, they said, not in the 23-county area of the Barnett Shale. And in fact, there were only 93,000 total jobs onshore and offshore for the U.S. In the entire U.S. sector. So again, I will let you, make up your own minds about industry's math when it comes to jobs creation. Record capacity. Excuse me. Industry likes to tell us that we're sitting at record capacity, and we are, thanks to thousands and thousands of new shale wells which have been drilled over the last few years. But these wells have been drilled in order to keep many of these companies from declaring bankruptcy and to meet debt service. This is, in my opinion, a mismanagement of natural resources. And the reason I say that is because if you are a mineral owner and they are harvesting your minerals, today prices went even lower still. I thought that I quoted a price of $2.48 last night, and we actually hit $2.39 today. Prices are plunging. And when they are harvesting your minerals, if you own them and they're harvesting them in order to meet debt service and keep themselves from going bankrupt, your minerals are gone forever, and you are being paid rock bottom prices for that. And that is not the typical way that this industry has done things in the past. But again, as I said, oil and gas companies typically sit on mountains of cash. They do not have high debt levels like these shale gas companies do. So I think that that's a mismanagement of natural resources. And further, record capacity is driving prices lower still, obviously, fell another, 9 cents today, and it's keeping them low. So while there's no doubt that we are sitting at record supply capacity, it may be for the wrong reasons. Further, if this capacity is the product of the drilling treadmill, whereas we've seen that more wells cannot keep up with production because older wells are declining so quickly, then I think it can be very reasonably argued that there's little depth behind this record capacity, and therefore there's little security. Once you let up on the drilling, supplies tumble very quickly indeed. Record capacity, however, instills a notion in the public that shale gas is extremely cheap and enormously abundant, when in fact this may be a false sense of security. One statistic that's bandied about is that the U.S. has a 100-year supply of gas thanks in large part to the shale plays. But now we learn that government estimates have been dramatically slashed, and further that EIA's original erroneous assumptions were based in large part on data provided to the government by industry. But something which is very important to consider is that these estimates do not take into account the cost of extracting this gas. And this is where I'd like to go next. to the financial anomalies that have cropped up with regard to costs and SEC reporting and even shareholder destruction. According to production history filed with the operators, and I want to stop here and make a very important point. The numbers I'm about to present to you tonight are on the production numbers. These are numbers that have been filed by the shale gas operators with state entities, such as the Texas Railroad Commission. These are not estimates or projections or, pie in the sky numbers from environmental activists or anything. These are hard, cold numbers filed by the operators of actual production with the state entities. And I'm also going to provide you with some numbers that came from SEC filings. So again, these are public numbers that the operators have to file by law. So there's very little wiggle room here to get around these numbers. Okay, so according to production history filed by the operators in various states, shale gas volumes have not turned out to be as homogeneous as once thought. In the earlier days of the play, it was widely touted that you could drop a bid in anywhere and you would hit gas. But Aubrey McClendon admitted, finally, that there was a time when you were all told that any of the 17 counties in the Barnett would be just as good as any other county. We found out that there are about 2 or 2.5 counties where you really want to be. Yet even within these core areas, production can be quite erratic. Geologists in Houston that I have been working with have examined 9,100 of the 15,000 wells in the Barnett, and they have found that less than 6% of them have met minimum economic thresholds. They have really had dismal returns. Further, Dr. John Lee, who actually has just moved to the University of Houston, I have to update my slide, he is the architect of the SEC rule change, which I'm going to get to in just a few minutes and he's a reservoir analyst and a petroleum engineer. And I engaged in an email exchange with him a little over a year ago, and he had this to say to me in an email. It is sometimes said that 20% of shale wells carry a project, the other 80% can easily be uneconomic. Now, keep this in mind. As I stated before, shale production, by its very nature, just by the way they have to do the fracture stimulation, it covers vast acreages of land, vast tracts of land. And the pad sites, as I said, when a play is fully developed or close to being fully developed, you will find pad sites approximately every half a mile, north, south, east, and west in a grid pattern over an enormous area of land. And 80% of these wells can be easily uneconomic. These are some more quotes that just came out recently in the last few weeks on shale consistency. This from financial researcher at ITG. He said the quirky nature of shale geology means the risks are high that an investment made in a sparsely drilled prospect will go bust. And another quote, one parcel of land may hold enough fuel to justify prices, while the adjacent land is almost worthless to drillers. This is exactly what Aubrey McClendon was talking about, that you were told at one time that we could drop a drill bit in anywhere, but we know now we can't. Okay, so I borrowed this slide because I think it's an outstanding visual from the geologist in Houston. This is a slide of the Barnett Shale in North Texas. Every place that you see blue is literally a carpet of wells. It's a carpet of wells. Every place you see red is a well that made money. I think that's a very damning slide. Sorry, my computer keeps going down. I get off and start talking. Okay. Now let's get into the SEC rule change, because this is where the claims of the Ponzi scheme and the Enron moments came, according to emails written by industry insiders, which the Times did an outstanding job of exposing. Since the SEC rule change for oil and gas was adopted in 2009, companies can now claim reserves that were previously not allowed and book them without a mandatory third-party audit. Now, I don't have a problem so much with claiming reserves that weren't previously allowed. The rules before that the Securities and Exchange Commission had implemented were pretty strict, and you couldn't, what that means, in case anybody doesn't know, is that if you have a what they call a proved well, producing well, then they can extrapolate out a certain distance, and they can say it's reasonable to expect that we can pull gas out of this area around this producing well. Well, they allowed them to extrapolate out further. Now, some of them are extrapolating out exponentially, and the SEC has called them to task for that. But anyway, that's another story. But I don't have a problem with them going out further. What I do have a problem with is that the SEC went on to allow them, because of the pressure put on the SEC in the public comment period by the industry, to claim these reserves without an independent third-party audit. So we simply have to take the company's word for it that the gas actually exists. That is problematic. There's a clear upside, obviously, to being able to book more reserves. It's the ability to make it appear that your company is growing, that finding costs are plummeting, and it makes it look generally that your company, it can make it look generally that your company is actually performing better than it may really be. So, this is a quote from Mark Papa of EOG Resources, CEO, who told financial analysts that those that select to book liberally after the rule change goes into effect can have extremely low finding costs, and those that choose to book more conservatively could have higher finding costs. EOG went on to increase reserve estimates by 135%, which is enormous under the new SEC rules. Other shale companies did the same. Some increased reserves by as much as 200%. That was PetroHawk, by the way. Such massive reserve revisions may make a company, obviously, as I just stated, appear to be much more attractive than it may really be, and in turn, it can also allow these companies to leverage up or borrow more monies. Obviously problematic when these reserves have not been independently verified. But borrowing more money, well, I just stated that. Industry experts and officials often state that costs drop dramatically with the economic downturn, but while overall costs did indeed drop throughout 2009, the dramatic drop in costs seen in some of these shale gas companies cannot be completely explained away by this factor. Ernst & Young did a study where they said finding and development costs decreased an average of 48% for the oil and gas industry as a whole. These declines, they said, were driven by the previously discussed decreases in all categories of spending, but along with strong reserve additions. At 5 of the 7 shale gas companies that I studied, however, costs dropped considerably more than the overall market decline in their industry. These were the same companies that had chosen to increase their reserve estimates substantially, some by as much as 200%. So let's take a look at some of these. For instance, PetroHawk's finding and development costs in 2008 under the old rule were $51.50. Under the new rule, literally overnight, they dropped to a mere $7.03, which was an overall decline of 86%. Comstock Resources and PetroQuest also had similar declines in excess of 75%. Range Resources and Chesapeake Energy tied at 66% declines, well in excess of the average 48% seen amongst the oil and gas producers as a whole. EOG's cost declines were the only one of the companies that I studied that were in line with the 48% decrease. These plummeting cost figures raise questions because the reserve estimates, obviously, as I keep stating, have not been independently verified. And further, these costs do not include sunk costs, such as lease costs. But by breaking these out, it can appear that the costs are lower still. And the companies quite often will do that. But leases have to be paid for. They're part of the overall transaction costs, and they cannot simply be disregarded as part of the overall cost picture. And when they're factored back in, costs can rise again significantly. So, going back to Dr. John Lee, I'm sorry to give you such a long quote here, but it's a very important quote. He, as I stated, is the architect of the SEC rule change, and in this email to me, he went on to say that with proper averaging and a large enough sample of wells, we believe that we can predict the average outcome of a drilling program without the ability to predict the outcome of drilling any individual well. If we do not have enough wells for valid statistics for what we've already drilled, or if we don't have enough future drilling opportunities to have reasonable expectations of average outcomes, then we may have to write down our assets as some are doing. Now, I found this statement very, very interesting because he states, if we don't have enough future drilling opportunities to have reasonable expectations of average outcomes. The Barnett Shale was touted to be an economic powerhouse for the next 40 to 50 years. In fact, it lasted about 6 to 7. And so he's stating that they clearly did not think that they had enough future drilling opportunities to have reasonable expectations of average outcomes. And we know that, we've seen that because, as I stated earlier, reserves have not been as great as they stated. So let's take a look at what the companies began doing at that point. Indeed, shale companies began writing down assets in 2009. Impairment charges as a percentage of total shareholder equity has been enormous at some of these companies. Petrohawk charged off assets as impairments that accounted for 185% of total shareholder equity between 2008 and 2010. Quicksilver Resources charged off an incredible 151%, Chesapeake Energy 115%, Devon 102%. Range also took a hefty impairment charge when it sold off all of its Barnett Shale assets, which was the impairment charge was about $500 million, which, just doing the math in my head, is about 40 to 45% of Range's total shareholder equity. So as you can see, these charges can be highly problematic when considering shareholder value destruction. I mean, when you've charged off more in assets than your shareholder equity is even worth, it's problematic. So that gets us to the next question of, if 80% of these wells, according to an industry insider, can easily be uneconomic, is this the highest and best use of our land? As you can see, according to Mr. Burns' estimates and the geologists that work with him, over 90% of the wells in the Barnett have not met minimum economic thresholds. The environmental costs can be huge. 94% of sites, as I stated, in Fort Worth have a known carcinogen being emitted in measurable quantities 24/7. Water is permanently removed from the hydrological cycle, and here's my favorite part. They love to say that, well, we don't use any more water than a golf course. And certainly you can argue the merits of watering golf courses. I know I can, because as I told everybody last night, I absolutely hate golf. I'm dreadful at it. And I wouldn't care if all golf courses disappeared. But that is a very misleading statement by industry, because water that is put on a golf course, even if it's put on in copious amounts, it can percolate back and it recharges the underground aquifers. That is not the case with water used for hydraulic fracturing. It is so contaminated, not only with the chemicals that they use, but also with the radioactive materials and other debris and so forth that comes up, back up out of the formation, that it must be injected deep into underground wells and stored, and it is permanently removed from the hydrological cycle. I would love for a hydrologist to do a study to see what are the impacts, the estimated impacts of how much water that's been used already, and how that will ultimately impact the hydrological cycle. So you can see, well, let's begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together here. We've seen now that production is at the expense of conventional projects, so it isn't really as great as it appears. Reserves do not have to be independently verified. Jobs have been overstated. Revenues and taxes have been overstated. Well decline curves are very steep, so security of supply is questionable at best. Reserve estimates have jumped considerably on company books, but estimates by government have been slashed significantly, and industry insiders consider that 80% of shale wells could easily be uneconomic. This, in my mind, is a rather alarming picture. So then we get to the question which always arises, and I'm going to preempt you because somebody's going to ask it afterwards if I don't, and that is, if shale gas is such a dud, then why are the majors, and most especially the foreign majors, falling all over themselves to invest in shale gas? And it's a very valid question, and I'm hopefully going to answer that for you here tonight. Over the last few weeks, we've seen near record prices paid by foreign entities for U.S. assets. $8 billion in deals was consummated in the first 2 weeks of 2012 alone. Why? Okay. The first thing that you have to keep in mind is that there are two sets of economics for these companies, publicly traded companies. What I call, I refer to them as, the first set is the field economics. It's what are the wells actually doing, what are my costs, etc. What's actually happening out in the field. The second set of economics for these companies is what I call street economics. And street economics are very different indeed. They are essentially, what do I have to do? What do my financial statements have to look like? What do my balance sheets, have to show in order to keep the financial analysts interested in my stock and in order to keep investors interested in my stock and make it appear that my company has a reasonable amount of growth ahead of it, and so that the analysts will keep touting the stock and more people will want to invest it and the share price will rise. Those are very different and they do not always jibe one with the other. I also want you to keep in mind the fact that international crude pricing in 2011 hit record levels. That's a very important point to consider, particularly when we're talking about foreign majors here in a few minutes. And the last thing I want you to keep in mind is that the majors, without exception, whether domestic or foreign, have not been able to grow reserves in over a decade. That is a very important point to consider, because if you're a financial analyst looking at a company and you see no prospect or you see no potential for growth in reserves, then ultimately your share price is going to languish, and that is not where you want to be when you're a publicly traded company. If you noted, it was very interesting to me because the majors dabbled in shale gas. They all dipped their toes in the early days, and in fact, ExxonMobil came out and made a statement just a few months ago, and I should include this. In fact, I'll try and remember to do that in future presentations. His quote, the CFO said, yeah, we did dabble in shale gas in the early days and we just couldn't make it work economically. And I thought, of course you couldn't. But when the majors wanted to go in and buy the shale assets was when? It was right after the SEC rule change, when reserves could be then bought up by the majors in shale gas. And of course, these reserves don't have to be independently verified, and you could show growth in reserves once again. So that became very attractive, and it was just a matter of months before ExxonMobil scooped XTO Energy up right after the SEC rule change went through. Sorry. So, something very interesting has been going on for quite some time. We've heard industry loudly and very publicly extolling the Pickens Plan, which is essentially a roadmap to use more natural gas, convert our power plants to natural gas, convert our truck fleets to natural gas, etc. It's a good populist argument, and it plays very well in the current political environment, because industry can promise us that we will be energy independent, all thanks to shale gas. We can bring jobs home and we can bypass all the unpleasantness of international terrorism, all thanks to shale gas. This is a very popular populist argument at present. But amid all this fanfare and media blitz, something else was going on behind the scenes, and it was very quiet indeed. And that was the fact that industry had begun to approach the Department of Energy, and they had asked that they be able to flip import LNG terminals. And LNG is liquefied natural gas. And in order to transport natural gas internationally, you have to liquefy it. And so it has to go into a terminal and go through this process, and then it's loaded onto ships. And they began submitting permits to the Department of Energy very quietly. That was not included in the populist rhetoric that we hear so often, but they began submitting permits, and it was to ask that these existing LNG import terminals be flipped to LNG export terminals so that shale gas could be exported to the rest of the world. That obviously does not jibe with the populist argument of American gas made, taken by Americans for Americans. The first export permit was granted just a few months ago in October. There are 7 more sitting at the DOE as we speak, and thus far, just from those first 8 permits, they have already committed, the operators have already committed 20% of our shale gas supply for overseas export. That's just in the first 8 permits, and there will, of course, be more permits coming. So shale gas, there's no doubt about it now, it will indeed be exported from the U.S. Now, you may be wondering, where is she going with this, and why do we care? Well, this is very important, I think. I want to start out with a couple of quotes here. This is from the Oil and Gas Financial Journal. The Chinese are willing to pay a premium to secure North American resources necessary to feed the growing Asian economy. So our natural resource will be used to grow Asian economies. This quote from Shell, I think, is just about as straightforward as you can get. Shell has placed a big emphasis on North American gas. It's an area of growth for us. We've invested something like $15 billion since 2004 in the onshore sector, and what we develop here, we'd like to export to the rest of the world. So, how does this work? The price of natural gas in Asia and in Europe, but in Asia, is tied to the price of crude oil. Now, do you remember? I asked you to remember that crude oil hit record highs in 2011. So the Asians do not pay the Henry Hub price, and the Henry Hub price is our own, the U.S. domestic natural gas price, which, as I stated earlier, as of today, hit $2.39. The Asians currently, right now, are paying anywhere from $12 to $15 per MCF for gas. So if you're an operator, who do you want to sell your product to? Somebody who's going to pay you $2.39 or somebody who's going to pay you $15? None of us in this room have to think very long about that one. So operators can extract, pipe, refine, and ship this gas to Asia for about $9 and get paid $15. That is a very handsome spread, and that's precisely what they intend to do with it. You can see now why the majors, and particularly the foreign majors, want to get their hands on U.S. shale gas assets. But what impact will this have on you and I? It's fantastic for the operators, but what will the impact be on us? I got this figure from industry. They themselves boast that the U.S. economy over the last couple of years has had an economic stimulus equivalent to $250 million per day because we enjoy low natural gas prices. I do not doubt that figure at all. I think that's absolutely a valid figure, even though it came from industry. There's no doubt about it that there are benefits to a low natural gas price. In some places in the country, electricity prices have dropped by 50%. I mean, that's substantial. So there's definite benefits here. There's also benefits to U.S. manufacturers right now. The plastic industry has announced that they're bringing jobs back into the U.S. They're going to ramp up production in the U.S. because they see shale gas as a cheap and abundant source of energy going forward. However, if natural gas is exported, then prices will inevitably rise because there will be international pricing pressures put on our domestic price. Capitalism is capitalism, and it's whatever the market will bear. And right now, the market will bear over 5 times what the domestic price is. And so it is inevitable that our domestic price will rise once shale gas begins to be exported to other countries, and it could rise precipitously. The jury's out on just how much that rise will be. So if that does indeed happen, then this would affect what I refer to as a classic consumer squeeze. How would that work? It'll work like this. If you're an American consumer and you've now converted your electricity to be more dependent upon natural gas, which is the Pickens Plan, very widely and publicly touted by industry, what they want us to do is convert power plants, truck fleets, etc., so that we are more dependent upon natural gas. Essentially, what they want us to do is put us in the same boat with natural gas that we are in presently with crude oil. We are a very dependent nation on crude oil, and now they want to make us a very dependent nation on natural gas. So manufacturers who believe that shale gas will be cheap and abundant going forward will ramp up production in the U.S. using natural gas as their feedstock. Truck fleets used to transport goods will now be more dependent upon natural gas to move inventory around the country. Only now, natural gas prices have gone through the roof thanks to Asian demand. So perhaps I should let Aubrey McClendon, CEO of Chesapeake Energy, tell you what will happen when gas prices, quote unquote, go through the roof. Mr. McClendon stated that if natural gas prices, quote, went through the roof, 70% of American homes on natural gas will be cold. 35% of American homes and businesses and factories that use electricity from natural gas will be dark. Crops that require natural gas fertilizer will not be grown. He himself referred to this as a stark future. Yes, indeed, it will be, but he and his colleagues will be very, very rich indeed. Thank you very much.